Debate, the honourable member for Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and just want to provide those that are watching and members with a number of points about what we do and don't support in this legislation. The bill provides some new legal tools that speed up the creation of marine protected areas, but it falls far short of Canada's international commitments to protect our marine biodiversity. The bill fails to set minimum protection standards, and I'll speak a little bit more about that, and targets for zoning for marine protected areas, which renders the designation inconsistent at best and meaningless at worst. It gives the minister far too much latitude to decide what activities are permissible in an MPA. If oil and gas exploration can take place in an MPA, what's the point of the designation? So those, Mr. Speaker, are some of our concerns. I want to talk about the NDP's proposed amendments. We proposed these at the Standing Committee, Fisheries and Oceans. We had 5 major themes. All were supported by witness testimony. So I start off with our first amendment focused on establishing minimum protection standards. I think it makes sense if you don't have a minimum basic standard of what you're talking about in terms of protection, it gets very hard for either industry or for those concerned about protection, governments, nations, First Nations, to know exactly what is the definition criteria and how do we meet a minimum basic level of protection. So that for us is something that I think the government could focus a lot more on. The second theme was maintaining ecological integrity as the primary objective of an MPA, or marine protected area. And that is critical, achieved through networks, other areas of protection, either federal designations or provincial or Indigenous levels, all can play part in a constructive network of protection and protected areas. So that maintaining that ecological integrity is critical for, that's the whole concept behind an MPA. The third theme is creating co-governance with Indigenous peoples and establishing the authority of Indigenous guardians. Mr. Speaker, this is a critical element of today of managing our resources, our oceans, our land, our watersheds. We just saw on the House of Commons floor in the chamber an unprecedented ceremony recognizing those wrongs that were made by, well, it was prior to Confederation, but acknowledged by this government about how our new relationship with First Nations must be, and that must include co-management. So when we're talking about marine protected areas, we must look at and recognize a new way of managing our oceans and protecting our oceans. The fourth main theme was establishing no-take zones. This is a critical element the international community has drawn to. I'll speak more about that in a minute, about the importance of having some areas within the MPA. It doesn't have to be the entire area, but there is scientific evidence that shows that the more areas that are no-take or that have the highest level of protection flourish the best. You'll have recovery, or you'll have protection of sensitive ecosystems when you establish no-take zones. And Canada falls very far behind when looking specifically at no-take zones. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the fifth area is to facilitate the implementation of a network of MPAs. So not just specifically looking at the protected areas. Often on land we look at parks, but on the water we call them marine protected areas. And it's like on land, we need to provide connectivity. And so establishing networks of MPAs is a critical element. Mr. Speaker, other elements touched on similar themes, and I just want to highlight those that we heard at the Standing Committee. Ecological integrity, the networkability of MPAs, and the recognition of Indigenous rights. We're past at the committee stage. Our amendments were stronger and it's regretful that they were defeated. We heard from many witnesses who supported the bill at committee, but they were also they supported our proposed amendments. On November 23rd of last year, Linda Nowlin of Staff Counsel at West Coast Environmental Law testified, and I quote, "The law is currently very inconsistent. As you've heard and will probably continue to hear, people are astonished to learn that oil and gas exploration, undersea mining, and damaging fishing activities are all possible in the tiny fraction of the sea that we call marine protected areas. That's why an unprecedented 70,000 Canadians, members of the public, spoke about one of the proposed new MPAs, the Laurentian Channel, and said that we need to keep harmful activities out of these areas," end quote. On November 21st, Mr. Bill Wareham, the science project manager from the David Suzuki Foundation, testified about the need to strengthen the bill with respect to Indigenous protected areas. And he said, quote, "I think the other area of the Act that needs strengthening is the area of Indigenous protected areas, so IPAs. Many Indigenous peoples have a long-standing interest in conserving resources and protecting areas of their traditional territory. And there's an opportunity to enable the government to accommodate Indigenous protected areas, which are determined, managed, and governed by Indigenous people. This amendment would not only facilitate additional conservation of natural resources, but would take Canada further down the path of reconciliation with Indigenous communities," end quote. Mr. Speaker, on November 9th, Susanna Fuller, the Senior Marine Conservation Coordinator for Ecology Action Centre, testified the following, quote, "It makes no sense not to prohibit open net pen aquaculture, for example, in a protected area that includes an important river for wild Atlantic salmon. It makes no sense to allow seismic testing and oil and gas drilling in areas that are important for marine mammals or that are closed to bottom fishing to protect deep-sea coral and sponges. Essentially, our Oceans Act MPAs are lacking in some key ground rules that perhaps could not have been foreseen when it was drafted 20 years ago. Third, the current lack of standards in this Oceans Act, and more broadly the lack of standards across all of the tools used to protect the marine environment, national marine conservation areas, Fisheries Act closures, means that there is confusion at the ground level, which is not necessary. Canadians expect that in our terrestrial protected areas, industrial activities will not be permitted. In the marine environment, and I think you've received our brief already that we put together with several other NGOs from across Canada, we're strongly advocating that activities like bottom trawling, oil and gas exploration and development, open net pen aquaculture, and seabed mining should simply not happen in our marine protected areas. This does not preclude other low-impact human uses like fishing with low-impact gear, ecotourism, and marine transportation," end quote. Mr. Speaker, the scientific evidence clearly demonstrates that bottom trawling has significant damaging impacts to seafloor ecosystems, and that no-take fishing areas are a key component of effective MPAs. Research shows that MPAs that permit varying levels of fishing and other activities are less effective at achieving biodiversity than fully protected areas. International best practices suggest MPA core no-take zones should encompass 75%, 3/4, Mr. Speaker, of a given MPA. Now, Canada is nowhere close to reaching that high bar. Remember, this is the international community looking at examples in countries around the world that say this is where we have the most success is when there is establishment of large no-take zones within your MPAs, which again, Mr. Speaker, is a very small fraction of a country's economic zone in the ocean. So remember, we're talking about a small sliver of the ocean. So right now, the minister has the discretion to determine what activities are allowed in an MPA and how restrictive each zone in an MPA can be. So far, Canada's Fisheries Minister has implemented a no-take zone in only 5 MPAs to date. And those are tiny, those areas are tiny when you compare to the overall MPA. So I believe Canada should follow international examples and make no-take zones the rule rather than the exception when it comes to MPAs. We believe that reconciliation should be a part of all legislation. Additional designations are welcome tools, but it does not make sense to exclude explicit recognition of Indigenous rights in the Oceans Act. Given the implications of MPAs on Indigenous constitutional rights, it's irresponsible. The federal government's commitment to implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and working in true nation-to-nation relationships with Canada's Indigenous peoples, consistent with the Canadian Constitution, should be reflected in the Oceans Act. Mr. Speaker, marine protected areas are an opportunity to forward the cause of reconciliation, but Bill C-55 fails to include specific provisions to accomplish this. There are already successful examples in Canada of co-management that the government could look for inspiration. For the co-management agreement between the Haida Nation on the west coast of Canada and the Government of Canada over the Guayhanas National Park Reserve, or Parks Canada's cooperative management model in the Arctic. Those are a couple of examples. The best practices should be the rule and not the exception. Now, Mr. Speaker, I would just like to talk a little bit about how we arrived at, because there has been some discussion about not going too far or not going far enough. Well, let's remember, if we go back to 1992, when the international community came together, Canada signed on to that commitment to protect at 5 and 10% of our oceans. And that was over 25 years ago, Mr. Speaker. So when I hear the Conservatives talk about this is going too fast, or that we're protecting too much, I think we have to look at the context in which the international community came together over a quarter century ago and talk about how are we doing. Because it's only just recent that we've managed to surpass 5% protection, as I've said during my remarks, that many of those protected areas, those MPAs, don't include strong protection or don't enjoy strong protection of things like no-take zones. So if you are to look at the perspective of where we're at, and many countries are much further ahead than Canada, given that they've done far more since 1992 to look at protection of their oceans, Canada has a long ways to go. So this is a move in the right direction. Consultation is critical. We need to get that right. I don't argue at all when it comes to taking time to get it right in terms of consulting those, whether it's territories, provinces, First Nations, industry, environmental organizations, those that are really concerned about our oceans and our ocean marine ecosystems. But at some point, we need to move forward with achieving the protection that's needed in order to provide a healthy, flourishing ocean. Mr. Speaker, the bottom line is our oceans are in serious trouble. I remember reading a report back in 2012 from the United Nations top marine scientists who pointed out that our major predators in the oceans are in steep decline. For instance, sharks. We're losing sharks at a phenomenal rate. Now, I read back then it was between 38 and 70 million sharks a year are being lost. I didn't even know there were that many sharks in the ocean, and that's how many were being killed. Now, the scientific knowledge has increased since 2012, and in fact, what they're finding is it's up to 100 million sharks a year being killed for their fins. Those predators play a key role in maintaining ecosystem balance. We're losing, that's just one example of what's happening in our oceans. When you look at marine ecosystem issues like plastics in our oceans, we are swimming in our oceans full of plastics. That's right. In some areas, it's microplastics. But this is a huge problem. And then when you look at the issue of climate change, our oceans are changing rapidly. Ocean acidification is happening at an alarming rate. These issues have to be dealt with. The world needs to come together. Canada needs to play its part. Protecting portions of the ocean in the exclusive economic zone is a way to do that. This is one tool in the toolbox that we need. We need to do more. We need to move faster. But again, I appreciate the comments about consultation because it is critically important that all that have an interest in our oceans and our ocean ecosystems are included in important decisions. I hope this legislation moves forward. I hope the government listens to the amendments and the concerns, and I hope that they incorporate those to get them right, because that's what's needed. And I hope that they listen to the NDP's, I think, thoughtful and optimistic comments about what we've heard from many witnesses who've testified, and not just at the Standing Committee of the Fisheries and Oceans, but in general, writing to me over the years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate the comments from my colleague across the way. I believe that the government has been listening consistently, virtually since taking office on this particular issue, all the way up to committee stage. My understanding is that there were, in fact, a number of amendments that were proposed, some suggested, in particular, I'd say, from the leader of the Green Party, and ultimately incorporated into what we have here today. And I'm wondering if my colleague could maybe just provide his thoughts in regards to the amendments that were brought in, for specific amendments that were brought in, if he would like to have anything to add specifically with respect to those amendments, recognizing, of course, that there's always room to grow into the future, and this is something that's not going to be, the last chapter of a book on such an important issue. But in fact, I suspect, Mr. Speaker, that we will see in time. We have a very aggressive, progressive Atlantic caucus in particular, but also along the coastal region of British Columbia on this particular file, as all MPs, I suspect, of all political stripes are concerned about our oceans.
Member for Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my honourable colleague's question about the amendments. As I mentioned in my speech, that unfortunately the amendments that we put forward were not accepted at the Standing Committee. They were defeated. And the government hasn't incorporated. I outlined 5 of those. I talked about establishing minimum protection standards, maintaining ecological integrity, creating co-governance with Indigenous peoples, establishing no-take zones, and facilitating the implementation of networks and MPAs. Those were areas of concern that we put forward. We heard from witnesses that testified that said these are important areas. Unfortunately, the government didn't listen on those elements. I appreciate my honourable colleagues' comments about going forward, that they will look at this. I hope they do, and I hope they incorporate this. I know going forward, the minister has committed to looking at minimum protection standards by establishing an advisory body to get input, and I appreciate that. I think that's important. However, obviously, I think we need to have that in the legislation.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Member from Port Moody Coquitlam for his comments and his background on the fisheries file. It's an honor to work with him on the fisheries committee. But I want to compare my knowledge and background in conservation along with the member from Red Deer Lacombe and his background in conservation and parks. One of the things we've seen from our work on the ground is that there's a difference between conservation and preservation. With conservation, we see that you use the resource responsibly, but you receive a benefit from that use so that you have something to put back into the resource afterwards. Preservation, as these some of these marine protected areas are being proposed, the member from Port Moody Coquitlam is proposing absolute no-take. So that means you've got to provide something from nothing, or else you've got to take something from somewhere else to support what you're doing. That, to me, sounds like the difference between conservatism and socialism. I'd like the member to explain what it is he's going to be taking from in order to provide these fully no-take zones. Obviously, that can't happen, but also how that relates to the disability to do anything with overall predator or wildlife management within these no-take zones. We've seen the dangers of that. Yellowstone Park, for example. The wolves and major predators have been removed from that area, but now they have been reestablished there. But without any control, they're now wreaking havoc on neighboring agricultural crops, products, the beef industry down there. How does the member propose that those types of issues are going to be dealt with entire no-take areas? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, I'd like to thank the member from North Okanagan Shuswap for his kind words. I appreciate that, and he does raise an important point. Now, I do want to respond, first of all, about the context, and I hope I made it clear in my speech that we're talking about a small percentage of the ocean in our economic exclusive zone in each, on all three coasts in our country. In each country, it's only the small sliver of the economic zone that we're referring to when we look at protecting areas, so MPAs within that area. So when you look at that, the exclusive zone, now we're only talking about 5 to 10%. So we're talking about a tiny percentage of the exclusive zone. So an even smaller part. Now when I mentioned about no-take zones, I was talking about a percentage of the MPA itself. So an even smaller part. Now this is with the idea that MPAs will play a role in helping protect marine biodiversity and helping encourage it to flourish. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, over the last quarter of a century, we've seen the opposite happen. This is why we need to protect our oceans, to protect our ocean economy, and to protect the communities that rely on it. I know the member is talking about wise use and stewardship. I appreciate those, and I think that that's an important area. Conservation is critical. Preservation is also critical. So when we talk, I use the example of sharks, Mr. Speaker. We are at a point where we're beyond wise use and stewardship. That is critical that we continue to do that, but we have to look at preservation, or we're going to lose these amazing animals and these animals that we rely on for not only our community and our cultural importance, but our economies.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from Port Moody Coquitlam for his excellent speech, and especially the history of this whole process. Here we are 25 years after our commitments were made, and we've done essentially nothing to reach those commitments. We're at 5%. Australia and the United States are over 30%. And I just wanted to give him a bit more time to talk about the importance of these no-take zones. He mentioned briefly in that last reply about how they do encourage biodiversity, the growth of populations, but also when you have endangered species like the North Atlantic right whale that's going rapidly towards extinction off our east coast, and yet we're doing nothing really to stop that tragic consequence.
The honourable member for Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague and good friend from South Okanagan, West Kootenay, and I would also like to acknowledge the hard work that he's done before he even became a member of Parliament for work on mostly terrestrial biodiversity, but also his knowledge of biodiversity in general, and I appreciate his comments. And I think he comes from a very important and learned place when he talks about why it's important to have no-take zones within marine protected areas, because what science has shown, what traditional knowledge has shown, is where there's human activity, where there's a lot of industrial human activity, it is very detrimental to the ecosystem. Where there's areas where we have fished, where there's areas where we introduce oil and gas, we have impacts. So the importance of having no-take zones to allow the marine ecosystem, to allow those mammals, those fish species, those shellfish to flourish, to come back and thrive, is so critical. Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad that he asked me about the history, the point, and I brought that up in my speech because I think it's so important to provide a context. I referenced the last 25 years, quarter century, but if we look back in the last 200 years, all the trends are not good in terms of some of the impacts, the major impacts from industrial use and the way we are currently conducting ourselves in the ocean, marine, the marine area. So we obviously have to do things differently if we want these magnificent animals to survive and thrive, and if we want our communities, our coastal communities, and our coastal economies, our ocean economies, to survive and thrive. We need to do things differently. We need to look at protections. We need to look at networks of MPAs in protected areas.